Medieval winters were no joke, no central heating, no cozy blankets from the store, just cold, dark days and nights. People had to be creative to keep warm using what they had around them. Some methods sound strange now, but back then they were life or death. And this is how people fought the cold. When the cold hit hard, many people depended on a surprisingly simple tool: 2 clay pots. Winters were unforgiving, long nights, biting cold, and no modern heating or cozy blankets. Instead of worrying about bills, the real fear was freezing in your sleep. For peasants, warmth wasn't comfort, it was survival, and those 2 pots became vital, offering a small but crucial source of heat in the coldest months. Clay pot fire stoves were essential for the poor. Cheap, reusable, and safer than open flames, they used 2 terracotta pots, one smaller pot placed upside down over embers inside a larger one. The setup trapped and slowly radiated heat, working like a primitive space heater without bricks, mortar, or a chimney. This wasn't guesswork, it worked on real physical principles. Clay absorbs heat slowly and releases it over time. Once warmed, the pots radiated heat into the air. Some families added sand, gravel, salt, or stones between the pots to retain heat longer. Records from the coldest years of the 1300s, during the Little Ice Age, show widespread use of these heaters in rural areas where fireplaces were rare or poorly built. Firewood was expensive, and laws restricted who could gather it. Nobles had fireplaces, and servants. Peasants used clay, ash, and any legal burnable scraps. 2 pots cost far less than a bundle of firewood, which could cost silver coins in winter. Sometimes these heaters were the only thing keeping families from frostbite. People improvised. Adding herbs like rosemary or lavender gave off a calming scent. Pine needles reduced smoke bitterness. It worked as a basic air freshener, masking the smell of wet wool, unwashed feet, and smoke. On colder nights, families used several pot heaters near beds, doors, and straw bedding. Proper placement made a big difference. The warmth didn't spread far, but could thaw fingers and help kids sleep. But danger was close. These heaters cracked under extreme heat, especially if the clay was low quality or wet. A collapsing pot could spill embers onto wooden floors, bedding, or thatched roofs. Many homes were highly flammable. One accident could burn everything down. Town records from places like York, Ghent, and Bruges list fires started by these devices. Some spread across neighborhoods. In 1387, a heater was knocked over, allegedly by a cat, in a German village, destroying 12 homes and killing 3. By the late 1400s, towns started regulating them. Some banned them entirely. Others allowed use only during the day. Inspectors patrolled winter nights, checking for glowing windows or smoke. Getting caught could mean a fine equal to a week's wages. Still, families used them secretly when temperatures dropped below freezing. Archaeological digs across Europe have found scorched pots in sleeping areas. Some cracked from heat shock, others stained with smoke. In some cases, soot and ash layers help identify which pots were for heat, not cooking. These finds show how far people went just to survive winter. Today, a heater that spreads smoke, cracks, and starts fires wouldn't pass any safety check. But in the harshest centuries of the Middle Ages, people had few choices. The clay pot heater was cheap, clever, and, for a time, worth the risk. When winter temperatures dropped, medieval households adapted by changing their sleeping habits rather than relying on artificial heat or expensive fuel sources. One of the most widespread and practical solutions was group sleeping. Families would sleep together in a single bed to conserve warmth, using shared body heat to survive cold nights. This practice was common among both the poor and the wealthy, driven by necessity rather than comfort or tradition. In peasant homes, entire families slept in the same bed. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes even servants shared sleeping space. The arrangement followed a pattern. The most vulnerable, such as infants, the elderly, or the sick, were placed in the middle of the bed where it was warmest. Adults and older children who generated more heat and could tolerate colder air slept on the outer edges. This positioning helped reduce exposure to cold air and increased overall warmth, especially in households with no insulation, proper flooring, or protective wall coverings. The practice was not limited to lower-class households. Even in manor houses, it was common for groups of servants to share beds. Historical records indicate that 4 to 6 individuals would often sleep together, even in households with more resources and available rooms. Space was conserved and heat was maximized by minimizing the number of rooms that needed to be heated or maintained using firewood, coal, or peat. In addition to people, animals were frequently included in the sleeping arrangement. Dogs and cats were commonly allowed to sleep in beds, especially during the coldest months. In rural homes, smaller livestock such as lambs or piglets might also be brought indoors to provide added warmth and comfort. The presence of animals increased the ambient temperature in rooms without stoves or fireplaces, making sleep more bearable through the worst of the season and helping prevent hypothermia in extreme conditions. The economic benefits of group sleeping were significant. Heating multiple rooms was costly, and in many homes, only the main room had a fireplace. Body heat was a reliable and renewable resource, and grouping together eliminated the need for excess fuel. When fuel like firewood, peat, or dung was scarce or expensive, conserving heat through close contact was often the only viable solution for poor or rural families trying to survive harsh winters. However, the drawbacks were notable. Sleeping in close quarters facilitated the rapid spread of disease and parasites. Lice, fleas, and scabies were common. Respiratory infections spread easily among family members, particularly in winter when homes remained closed and poorly ventilated. A single case of illness often led to full household outbreaks, particularly of colds, influenza-like symptoms, and other contagious conditions that worsened with malnutrition or damp conditions. During major disease outbreaks, such as waves of the bubonic plague, public health concerns led to changes in sleeping practices. By the 15th century, some regions introduced restrictions on bed sharing and emphasized better hygiene. In monastic settings and some urban households, rules were established to reduce contact during sleep, including requiring face coverings or designated sleeping positions. These measures marked early attempts to reduce infection through sleeping arrangements in pre-modern settings, though enforcement and effectiveness varied greatly across regions and communities. While body heat was free, some medieval people sought a more sophisticated heating approach with truly even warmth. The solution they found lurking beneath their feet, however, would prove both ingenious and deadly. During the Middle Ages, staying warm through the winter months was not just difficult, it was often illegal. Unlike today, where heating a home is a matter of paying a utility bill, medieval families had to rely on firewood or other fuel sources gathered from nearby forests. However, access to these natural resources was heavily restricted. Across much of Europe, forests were not public land. They were owned and regulated by the nobility, the church, or the crown. These landholders enforced strict rules about what could be taken and by whom, often treating even the smallest act of wood gathering as a criminal offense. In England, the forest laws established by William the Conqueror in the late 11th century were among the harshest. Designed originally to preserve hunting grounds for royalty and their guests, these laws placed vast tracts of land off limits to commoners. Within these designated royal forests, it was illegal to cut down trees, remove branches, or even gather wood that had already fallen naturally to the ground. Violators could face severe penalties, including fines, imprisonment, or, in theory, physical mutilation. Although the most extreme punishments were rarely carried out for minor offenses like picking up fallen sticks, the threat alone was often enough to instill fear. Similar restrictions existed across the continent. In France, the system of forest regulation included the droit de ramassage, which allowed peasants to gather wood only under tightly controlled circumstances. They were permitted to collect fallen twigs, but only those they could reach without tools. Anything beyond that, such as cutting branches or digging for roots, was forbidden without permission from the forest's owner. In practice, this meant that a family's ability to heat its home during the winter was entirely dependent on what the authorities deemed acceptable, regardless of need or hardship. Yet need often overrode legality. As winters grew colder and firewood remained scarce, wood theft became a common and necessary crime. Historical court documents from the mid-13th to mid-14th centuries show that in some regions, wood theft made up nearly 40% of all winter-related offenses. The punishments varied significantly depending on the location and the governing authority. In parts of medieval Germany, peasants caught stealing wood could be fined the equivalent of 2 weeks' wages, a significant burden for impoverished families. In English villages, offenders might be placed in public stocks to be humiliated in front of their neighbors. In the most serious cases, especially repeat offenses within protected royal forests, individuals could be jailed or physically punished, though such harsh outcomes were not common for first-time offenders. Despite the legal risks, communities developed increasingly sophisticated methods to gather fuel without being caught. These efforts were often coordinated at the village level. Silent woodcutting tools were crafted with cloth-wrapped blades to muffle the noise. Gathering teams were rotated on different nights to avoid creating patterns that could be detected by patrolling forest wardens. These wardens, employed by local lords or royal agents, were tasked with monitoring forest activity and apprehending anyone violating the rules. Villagers viewed them with a mixture of resentment and caution, knowing that being caught could mean fines their families couldn't afford. Or worse. Women played a central role in this dangerous work. Analysis of court records from multiple regions shows that women made up more than 60% of those charged with wood theft. This trend was consistent across much of Europe, including England, France, and Poland. Part of the reason was cultural. Gathering fuel was considered women's work, part of the domestic responsibilities assigned to wives, daughters, and mothers. In some cases, women also received slightly more lenient treatment than men when caught, as judges or lords may have viewed them as less threatening. Regardless, these women were not only caregivers, but also providers, risking punishment to ensure their families could survive the winter cold. The situation became even more desperate during periods of crisis, such as the Great Famine of 1315 to 1316. This devastating event, caused by a combination of heavy rains, crop failure, and food shortages, led to widespread hunger and economic breakdown. During this period, wood theft surged across Europe. In one English manor, records show a 280% increase in prosecutions for firewood theft during the famine years, followed by a complete drop-off, suggesting that enforcement simply became impossible. When half the village was breaking the law just to keep warm, there were neither the resources nor the will to prosecute everyone. This growing reality eventually prompted reforms in some areas. By the late 15th century, changes in social policy began to reflect a more practical understanding of the problem. In certain parts of Germany and Switzerland, communal woodlots were created, where villagers could legally gather fuel according to rules scaled to household size and income. Churches, too, began allocating parts of their woodlands for poor parishioners during the winter months. These reforms often functioned unofficially at first, with clergy turning a blind eye to those in need, but over time they became more structured, forming the basis for early systems of local welfare. Ultimately, for countless medieval families, gathering firewood without permission was not a rebellious act. It was an act of survival. The harsh legal codes clashed with the everyday reality of rural life, where cold could be just as deadly as hunger. Faced with the brutal choice between freezing or breaking the law, many peasants made the only choice they felt they could: to risk punishment for the sake of warmth. In the end, the laws may have remained on the books, but human necessity often had the final word. These banned heating methods remind us how fortunate we are today. Our heating concerns are efficiency and cost, not survival.